Welcome, everyone, to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the Planning Committee for the ICSS Sunday morning sessions. We're based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You can sign up at our website, ICSSmarks.org, to receive weekly email announcements for our Sunday morning sessions. Our speaker today is Roger Harris, who recently returned from Venezuela, where he was a U.S. Peace Council on-the-ground observer of the 2024 Venezuelan presidential election. Roger is a member of the Executive Committee of the U.S. Peace Council. He is also on the ICSS Sunday morning at the Marxist Library Planning Committee, and he is active with the anti-imperialist human rights group Task Force of the Americas, the SanctionsKill Campaign against universal coercive measures, and is a founding member of the Venezuela Solidarity Network. We're going to have a presentation by Roger, followed by a short break for announcements, and then questions from our session participants. So with that, I'm going to welcome Roger to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. Why don't you go ahead and take it, Roger?
Well, thank you very much, Alan. And as probably people who are familiar with this program, I've been with this program for a decade and a half, but it's always really a big honor when your peers ask you to speak. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'll be looking forward to this. I'll start with some slides I took in Venezuela, and then from there I'll go to a formal presentation. So let me do a screen share and does that work?
We see all your slides. There you go. You're on.
Okay, good. So I was there, as Alan mentioned, as part of a delegation. It was with the U.S. Peace Council. The delegation was made up of myself, Baman Azad, Jamal Barak. Baman is right next to me in this picture. Baman is Jamal Baraka, who's on the left, and Vijay Prashad, who was not in this picture. The gentleman in the blue shirt is Carlos Roan. He's the Deputy Foreign Minister of Venezuela, and he was our host. And they invited 910 foreign observers. Actually, they called them accompaniments. And we accompanied the election. It was an incredible experience, meeting leftists and activists from all over the country, many of them involved in unions, mass organizations, and particularly a number of people from communist parties just around the world. I got there very early in the morning of the 25th. And after a few hours of sleep, all the delegates went to a meeting place, and we got a briefing on how the electoral system works. And the person who briefed us was Diosdado Cabello. Cabello is the second in charge of the ruling Socialist Party, the PSUV, PSUV. He's in effect the person who's basically the day-to-day in charge of the ruling Socialist Party, and he was also President Maduro's campaign manager. And he went through in real detail how the electoral system works. It's the electoral system that the Carter Center called, and technically one of the best in the world, actually the best in the world. It's in terms of the technical aspects, it really is foolproof. There are 16 audits that of the system that I've done in the course of the electoral process of voting and after the voting count. Then this is the 25th. The 25th was the last day of the campaign, the official campaign. After the 25th, the the candidates are required not to campaign anymore, and the country goes dry. No alcohol is sold or consumed in public. And so we were invited to go to the terminus of the Maduro campaign and see the final rally. It was incredibly energetic affair. Maduro is the person sort of in the center of the screen in that blue shirt. The energy level was very, very high, and the numbers were phenomenal. We were, of course, at the terminus of it, the end of the campaign rally. But if you look at the stage there, you can see these screens, and on the left side of the screen, they were having satellite pictures, not satellite pictures, drone pictures of the crowds. And you could see the main avenue, and then there was about 8 different feeder avenues that were just jammed with people. There was a report by an individual by the name of Calvin Tucker. He's with the Morning Star newspaper in Great Britain. He took a taxi to the east side of Caracas, which is the wealthier part of the town, the Las Mercedes district. And Tucker went out there, or Calvin rather, went out there and went to see the final rally of the main U.S.-backed opposition figure, Maria Corina Machado, and her surrogate, Edmundo Gonzalez. And that rally, he said, was impressive. He walked from one end to the other and estimated about 100,000 people. He was quite impressed by the numbers. He then got a taxi, or actually a motorcycle taxi, to the downtown part of Caracas, where the Maduro rally was being held. And he got off and he said, oh, wow, this was very impressive numbers, about the same as the opposition rally. And then he realized that he wasn't on the main avenue. He was just on one of the feeder avenues. And there were a number of feeder avenues to the main avenue. And Calvin estimated that there was about 1 million people, about 10 times the size of the opposition rally at the Maduro rally. And that seemed to be the number that I heard, again, from people that were international observers. This is a video. I don't know if you can hear the sound, but it gives you sort of an idea of just how incredibly energetic the situation was. Maduro spoke for about 2 hours. He would speak for about 10, 15 minutes. Then he would break. Then they would have these rap singers come on, and he would dance very energetically, and then speak again, and dance and speak and dance. It was a very, very strong and energetic situation there. So, and you can see some of the different parties that backed Maduro besides the Socialist Party. The next day, we had technical briefings on the election process and on the situation in Venezuela by the top leadership in the country. And that include Cabello, who addressed us yesterday. He addressed us the previous day. He addressed us that day again. Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, and Jorge Rodriguez, the president of the National Assembly. And then the following day, the 27th, the delegates got a chance to hear from President Maduro, who briefed us on the current situation in Venezuela. And when you have to understand, this is a Latin American briefing on the current situation. So when he discussed the current situation, he started with the indigenous people and described the settler colonialist nature of the original Spanish colonialism of that country. And he went all the way to the present. Then the 28th was the day of the election. And we, my particular group, went on a bus and we went out to the capital of the state of Miranda. And we visited 4 polling stations. One of the things that kind of impressed me was that driving there was just lines and lines of people all over. I mean, the density of polling stations was huge, and the turnout was incredible. There were long lines. The lines were moving slowly but orderly, and the mood of the people was extremely festive. The people in the upper left-hand corner, those are shots of coffee. There's no drinking on election day at all, at least not in public. And that was true both in popular neighborhoods, that is poorer neighborhoods, and as well as wealthier, more opposition oriented neighborhoods. The mood on the line was very, very festive. The people, when they saw us and they could see our badges that we were international observers, they applauded, they waved at us, they were very excited about the situation, and both and I had no idea what people's political leanings were, but my sense was that everybody had a tremendous amount of pride in their electoral system and in the civic duty of voting. This is a bunch of guys. There's some women there, 2 young women, just goofing around in the line. Very, very festive situation in the voting situation. Kind of not quite the same thing as we have at home. And then at the polling stations themselves, there was a fairly heavy presence of security personnel, but I particularly liked the National Guard, National Militia. And the National Militia are mostly retirement age people. Venezuela is often accused by its detractors of being a dictatorship, but it's an interesting dictatorship in that they have armed and trained 5 million of their citizens to be in this national militia, and mostly the militia people in the polling stations. They mostly were helping elderly people, like people on wheelchairs, get around and stuff like that. Once in the voting in a polling station, you go to an individual room. It's called a mesa, the table, and the person who's voting, you can see in the left-hand corner, shows their national identification card. And then they look to the name to see if that name is the correct name for that particular mesa. And then on the right-hand panel, they have a biometric way of confirming the person's identity. They take a digital thumbprint, and this digital thumbprint it was pre-registered, and that's what opens the voting machine. The voting machine will not function until the digital signature of the thumbprint is given. And then you go into the voting machine. The voting machine is electronic. The machines are not connected to the internet during voting period, so that they can't be hacked or shut down. There's a lot of cyber attacks, both before and after the election, and during it as well. And that's actually been a constant in terms of the warfare against Venezuela. So this is what the ballot looks like. Each party has their candidates. You can see, and the order of the party's candidates are put in by the number of votes that party got in the previous election. There are 13 candidates, I believe it's 13 parties that supported Maduro, different parties. The opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, I believe there was 3 parties that he appeared on that ballot 3 times. And so when you're in the voting booth, you then look at the screen. You put your finger at the touch screen. You put your finger on the candidate of your choice with the party of your choice. The machine says, "Are you sure?" You say yes. If you say no, then you get a chance to do that again. If you say yes, then the machine records your vote And this is the very critical part, it gives out a paper receipt that tells what the candidate and party what you voted for. Then you go to the out of the voting booth, and then you put the receipt into a ballot box, which is sealed and not counted until the end of the process. And the end of the and then you leave by leaving your signature and your thumbprint on. I'm not sure actually whether this is the beginning or the end. I might be confounding that, but at one point in that process, you have to also leave your signature and your thumbprint to prove that you voted. Anyway, that was the 28th, and everybody went home, and it was quiet, at least for a short period. So now I'd like to go into the formal part of the presentation and talk about what happened afterward. So let me begin by comparing the election in Venezuela, the recent election in Venezuela, to the recent election in Ukraine. And you probably say, well, what recent election in Ukraine? And the answer is that there's supposed to be an election in Ukraine last spring when President Zelensky's term of office ended. But hey, he just decided not to run again, just continue in office. And actually, maybe they didn't really need to have an election in Ukraine because the major opposition party and the second largest party in Ukraine had already been banished, and so had all the opposition media. So that was what happened in Ukraine. I mention that because it contrasts with the corporate media's coverage of the Venezuela's July 28th presidential election, which was akin to an investigation of a homicide that was focused not on identifying the murderer, but on the unpaid parking ticket of the victim. The media has shifted the narrative on the Venezuela election into the minutiae of election proceedings and has ignored the much larger issue of U.S. interference in the internal affairs of another foreign country. Nowhere in the corporate media is there even an inkling that the U.S. imposed regime change activities in Venezuela or elsewhere might violate basic principles. This is not a question that the corporate press even asks. Given the machinations of the hemisphere's hegemon, for our purposes, I think it's instructive to examine who and why and how Washington backed another candidate. I mean, the whole idea of the United States running a candidate in another country's election should be a red flag. But let's go into what the mechanics of that and do a deeper dive. So the as soon as the election results were announced, the opposition immediately called for the election fraudulent. This came as absolutely no surprise. They had announced their intention to do so before the election. It was like a movie that we'd already seen and just replaying the tape. For 2 days, there were violent opposition demonstrations that were quite violent. They 25 people were killed, mostly government security personnel and targeted PASUV leaders, and also a few innocent bystanders, 25 mortalities, and a huge amount of property damage, mainly aimed at public things like hospitals, schools, food distribution centers, transportation hubs. Some statues of Hugo Chavez were toppled, and even a statue of an indigenous leader that was not associated with the Chavista movement was toppled, mainly just to be provocative and stuff like that. The government responded forcefully. Over 2,000 2,000 people were arrested, and after 2 days, what amounted to a coup attempt fizzled out. So I mentioned that the opposition called fraud in this election. The opposition and fraud called fraud actually in just about every one of the 39 national contests that have been held since the Bolivarian Revolution began a quarter of a century ago. And the two contests that they won and were lost by the Chavistas, they didn't call fraud, obviously. And I should mention, I use that word Chavista. It gets its name from Hugo Chavez, who originated the Bolivarian Revolution when he got elected in 1998, became president in 1999, and carried on by his predecessor, the current president, Nicolas Maduro. The far-right opposition in Venezuela, and I'm not talking about the whole opposition, but the far right is funded and largely directed by Washington. And their strategy has always been an insurrectionary strategy rather than a democratic one. Neither the far-right opposition nor the U.S. itself has recognized the legitimacy of the Venezuelan government ever since Maduro was first elected in 2019. The U.S.-backed opposition boycotted the 2018 election, and they did so in anticipation that, to them, they thought the country would fall, that it would be just about ready to collapse under the assault of the U.S. hybrid war. That did not happen, so that in 2024, the far-right opposition was compelled to contend in the presidential election, even though they didn't recognize the legitimacy of the government or its country's constitution or its constitutional institutions. Conditions had changed by now, mainly due to the successes of the Maduro administration in turning around the country's economic freefall. And in addition, Washington has failed to diplomatically isolate Venezuela through such stunts as some of you might be familiar with Juan Guaido, who was self-appointed as the interim president, stuff like that. Those things had all failed. The re-entry of the U.S.-backed opposition into the electoral arena was not based on democratic participation that recognized the Constitution or the institutions of the Venezuelan state. Rather, it was a private affair. And one of the things that showed this was that the opposition, the far-right opposition, again, I should emphasize, had what they called a primary. And this primary was not conducted by the official Venezuelan electoral authority. It's called the CNE, even though previous ones had. It was a private primary that was administered by an NGO called Sumate. And the Sumate, some of you might be familiar with it, is the recipient of the U.S. NED, National Endowment of Democracy Funds. The NED is well known as a CIA cutout. And in that primary, Washington's pre-chosen candidate, she actually auditioned before the U.S. Congressional Foreign Affairs Committee. The U.S. pre-chosen candidate, her name is Maria Corina Machado. She won in a crowded field of 13 candidates, and she won in this so-called primary by an incredulous 92%. Now, some of the other candidates actually in that private primary called fraud, and then Machado simply had the ballots destroyed because it turns out that the primary was administered by her own NGO, a private NGO, Sumate, and she could just have those ballots destroyed. Machado is an interesting person. She's despised by much of the other opposition. A faux populist, she's a member of one of the richest families in Venezuela. She went to Yale and has lived in Florida. And then while the populists suffered under U.S. unilateral coercive measures, she championed them and even called for military intervention into her own country. Very significantly, Machado has very, very strong ties with the international far right, notably the Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, Milei in Argentina, and various other far right groups. So she is very much part of the international far right. Washington backed Machado, knowing full well that back in 2019, 15 years ago, she had been barred from running for office. Back then, she had been a member of the National Assembly, and she accepted a diplomatic post with a foreign country in order to testify against her own country. And such treason is constitutionally prohibited in Venezuela, as it is in many other countries. But for the U.S., Machado's disbarment was a bonus. It allowed the State Department to claim that its candidate was unfairly disqualified when that was a given. They knew that she would be disqualified. They knew that she was chosen because of that. And that's because, and this is really the take-home message of this presentation, Washington's intent was not to encourage a free and fair democratic process, but it was to delegitimize the one already in place. Disbarred, Machado then personally chose her own surrogate, which was this person, Edmundo Gonzalez, who was a piece of work. He was a former diplomat way back in the 1980s. He was completely unknown, no electoral experience. He was infirm. He literally had to be propped up by Machado at campaign rallies, but most of the time, he convalesced at home in Caracas while she barnstormed the country. Now, the corporate press has this nonsense about a unified opposition. Actually, the opposition in Venezuela, much to Uncle Sam's chagrin, is anything but unified. You could look at the ballot. Besides Maduro, there were 9 other candidates on that ballot. Had the opposition really been unified, they would have had a shot at actually winning, because about 48% of the electorate by the government's, by the CNE's, the government electoral authorities' own count, 48% of the electorate did not vote for Maduro. Maduro only got 52% of the vote. The assertion that Machado Gonzalez had won, now Machado Gonzalez, and I'm using them kind of as one person, because really it's Machado using Gonzalez as kind of a surrogate. They claimed that they won the election by a margin of 70%. And that completely lacks any credibility. I mean, 70% would mean that 7 out of 10 Venezuelans supported them. And that hasn't been proven in the streets. The Machado campaign had a very good social media campaign, but it had nothing, their actual campaign on the ground was nothing like the Maduro campaign. Maduro really campaigned very, very heavily. I believe there was something like 300 campaign stops he made all around the country. And these campaign stops are sort of videos. They weren't simply that he would get on a stage and make a speech, but he would get into the crowd and walk into the crowd and press the flesh, something that, U.S. politicians never, ever do. The Chavistas were very, very well organized and spent a lot of energy organizing all over the country. Another proof that the Gonzalez Machado group couldn't possibly have gotten 7 out of 10 Venezuelans behind them was that after the election was over and after they called fraud, Machado called rallies on August 3rd and also on August 17th to protest. And the turnout for those rallies were actually smaller than their pre-election turnouts. Meanwhile, the pro-Maduro rallies during that period dwarfed the opposition's, and that was an indication of the high level of organization and popular support that remains in Venezuela for the Bolivarian Revolution. In addition, the platform that Machado ran on was not a popular one. It called for extreme neoliberal privatization of education, healthcare, housing, food assistance, and the National Oil Agency. So in backing somebody with such an unattractive, unknown and unpopular person as Edmundo Gonzalez, the United States really showed its colors and its disinterest and a good faith engagement in the democratic process. And that brings us to really the heart of the matter. Truly free and fair elections in Venezuela were impossible, not due to the supposed conspiracies of the ruling Chavistas, but because of conditions imposed by Washington by their hybrid war against Venezuela. 930 unilateral coercive measures have been imposed on Caracas by Washington. Venezuela is the second most sanctioned country. They euphemistically call these unilateral coercive measures sanctions. Venezuela is the most sanctioned country after Russia, and Venezuela is a much smaller country than Russia. These sanctions are as deadly as bombs. They've caused over 1,000 casualties, according to the United Nations. They are a form of collective punishment, and they are illegal under the charters of the UN, under the OAS, the Organization of American States, and illegal even under US law. Collective punishment is illegal. But the Venezuelan people went to the polls on July 28th with the sanction gun aimed at their heads. If they voted for Maduro, the coercive measures would likely continue and even be intensified. And this was the fundamental reality that's been left out of the discussion, particularly by the corporate press, but who are simply stenographers for the State Department. The paramount importance of the US's coercive measures have been ignored, while attention has been shifted to the intricacies of Venezuelan electoral law. So the larger picture gets lost in the statistical weeds. This shifted narrative is designed to place the burden of proof on the sovereign government to prove its legitimacy. Solutions were proffered by outside actors calling for new elections in Venezuela and the establishment of a transitional government. However, there's no constitutional mechanisms for doing that in Venezuela, nor are there any such mechanisms in most countries, including the US. Most importantly, this is a gross violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. Even the far-right opposition in Venezuela rejected these as unacceptable. 3 days ago, the Supreme Court of Venezuela affirmed the elections authorities' count, confirming the Maduro victory. And a polling firm, it's called Hinterlaces. It is not a pro-Chavista firm. The president of it was actually never a Chavista, but they are fairly neutral, or at least objective. And they did a poll after the election, and they found out that 60% of the Venezuelan populace do trust the results of the official C&E. So I want to conclude now so that we can get into a robust question and answer. I'll conclude with saying that Venezuela is being punished because of its insistence on its right to defend its national sovereignty in the face of continued US imperial aggression. So Alan, let's have announcements, and then we can do a Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Roger. Just a couple of quick announcements. We have a couple of sessions coming up in the next couple of weeks. On September 1st, again at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time, Sunday, The Paradox of Intellectual Property in Capitalism by João Romero Hermeto. That's Portuguese. He is based in Brazil and will be speaking about intellectual property and capitalism. That's next Sunday. And then on September 8th, the following week, again at 10:30, we have a presentation by Gabriel Rockhill, Western Marxism, How It Was Born, How It Died, and How It Can Be Reborn. We want to remind everyone that you can sign up for email notifications for our programs at ICSSmarx.org, where you can also find links to video recordings of past programs, contact us with feedback, and contact us to make suggestions for future programs and topics. You can also make a donation to support our Sunday morning program. We do have expenses related to delivering these programs. So please go to our website, sign up, get on the mailing list, check out future programs, and we'd love to see you come back. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a Q&A session. What I'd like to do is have everybody raise your hands, and you can do that by going to the Zoom window at the bottom, usually on the right. There's a reactions button, raise your hand. If you raise your hand, we'll call everybody. We'd like everybody to please try to keep your questions down to a minute or two, one question at a time, and to show respect for other participants and to the moderator of today's session. We're going to try and get everybody in. We already have a bunch of hands that have come up. I'm going to start off by calling on Raj to please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you,
ask
Alan.
your question, since you're
Roger,
pretty far away.
Thank you for a very convincing and clear presentation on what happened from your participation as an observer. I learned a lot from that, and it goes against what I read New York Times about Venezuelan elections. So my question to you is, I don't know if you had a chance to observe yourself the opposition rallies. You've shown us the pictures of PSUV rallies, and if you have any sense of, you could discern any class differentiation in the composition of people attending the rallies, the two rival rallies. That's one question. The other is, from your general going there, what is the actually class composition of support of Chavistas that you can observe versus that of the opposition? So from both your personal observation over time and this election. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Personally, it's hard for me to discern what the class composition of these groups are just from observation. I know a lot of people have claimed that the opposition rallies are whiter and wealthier, and the Maduro rallies are more people of color and more popular classes, but I really couldn't see that. We did not go to the opposition rallies. I would have liked to, but it was dangerous because they were fairly hostile. The person from the Morning Star newspaper who did go actually wore the colors of the opposition to go to that rally so that he could go kind of incognito. So I guess that's the best I can answer that question.
Can I just follow up on that? So from the pictures I saw, the situation of people, they seem well-fed. In India, you can tell a person if he's poor from his appearance, who's lacking even sufficient amount of calories. But here it seemed like everybody's at least well-fed caloric-wise. So how is this, all these sanctions, how is the government able to go around and able to feed the people?
That's an interesting question, and one of the kind of parts about welfare and the impact of sanctions is that they impact the popular classes more than the wealthy, and they're designed to do that because that they're designed to undermine the support of the government by the popular classes. But actually, what's happened in Venezuela, and this is not from personal observation, but from hearing other people and reading about it, is that there is actually amongst the popular classes, there is a problem of being overweight. Why is that? Because the poor people do not have as good access to fresh fruits and vegetables, highly nutritious protein and stuff like that. So they eat a lot of cornmeal. The national it would be corresponding to tortillas in Mexico, arepas. One of the impacts of poverty and one of the impacts of the sanctions has been dietary, which has forced the people in the more popular sectors to eat high carbohydrate, high caloric food that probably we'd want to see a more balanced diet in a better situation.
So that's like the United States. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next we're going to have Lucy, followed by Toby. So Lucy, if you would unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Well, I just wanted to know what's happening with maybe you don't know, but the Brazilian Lula and the other more progressive guy, what is it?
Petro
Colombia.
in Colombia.
Petro from Colombia, right. What is happening with them? Why are they demanding super proof that the government has?
Both Petro in Colombia, Lula in Brazil, and López Obrador in Mexico have cautioned to say, let the Venezuelan electoral process and go along its constitutional lines and see what the outcome is. But they did not endorse the election of Maduro. They just said, wait and see, and cautioned against that. Subsequently, from that announcement, the U.S. Had a very strong diplomatic initiative. Secretary of State Blinken, Brian Nichols, I think he's with the National Security Council, I believe, one of the U.S. agencies, put a lot of pressure on both on Venezuela, excuse me, on Colombia and Brazil, and both Petro in Colombia and Lula in Brazil at one point talked about possibly having new elections, absolutely ridiculous idea because there's no constitutional way to do that in any country or some power sharing type thing. They've kind of walked back on that. I haven't heard either of them say anything since the CNE, since the TSJ, the Supreme Court, confirmed the CNE foundings. And I should say the CNE still has 30 days to reveal the full documentation. And so that's not until the 28th of this month that legally they have to do that. Let me go on just a little bit more. So it looks like there is division within Colombia and in Brazil over their leaders' positions. Both of those countries, their leaders are in very precarious positions. The right wing are strong in both of those countries, Lula in particular
Hmm.
won with a very small margin, and the Bolsonaro group is still very strong. And in Colombia, the Uribe group is very, very strong. In Colombia, Petro had put together a coalition called the Pacto Histórico, the Historic Pact. And the Historic Pact is sort of his ruling coalition. The Historic Pact has recognized the Maduro election. And I understand that Lula's party, the Workers' Party, has also recognized the Maduro victory, but I haven't seen that in print. But I've been told by people who are close to them that they have done that. So this is a fairly fluid situation. What we have to really understand is the huge pressures of the hegemon from the north
Yeah.
on the entire hemisphere. And but when you think about it, if Maduro were to fall, that would greatly embolden the far right. In Colombia, the Uribe forces would be greatly emboldened, and Petro probably would not be able to withstand that. The same is true in Brazil. If their immediate neighbor, Brazil and Venezuela, have a common border, if Maduro were to fall, Lula's position, which is already very precarious, would be very much endangered, and there would be a tremendous amount of insecurity throughout the hemisphere. And so let me just go one step further on that analysis and go into a sort of a speculative limb. The United States has not taken a really front row and aggressive position right now on Venezuela. And I think the reason for that is that they are weighing the dangers of really opening chaos in the region, because if Maduro were to fall, surely, I mean, no question that Cuban, Venezuela, and Nicaragua would fall, but also some of the left-leaning other governments would be as well. And there would be a tremendous amount of violence, a vacuum that the drug cartels would come into. So it's a very, very volatile situation, and it's just unfolding. So thank you for that question.
Yeah.
Okay, next up is Toby, please go ahead, and then followed by Walter. So Toby, please go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to ask Roger about people exiting Venezuela. These people who are in the opposition claim that a lot of Venezuelans have voted with their feet and have left the country. Can you make any comment about that? It is a sizable number, is it not?
Very sizable. The figures are over 7 million. Sometimes they're put at 7.7, 7.8 million people have left the country. Conditions are bad. I mean, that is the purpose of the U.S. unilateral coercive measures, is to make conditions bad. There is a class basis in the out-migration, is that it costs money to leave.
Of course.
And, so the wealthier people have a greater opportunity to leave. So there's a bias toward wealthier people leaving, though people from the popular classes have left as well.
They are not the ones who are suffering, though.
And that's true also in Cuba and also in Nicaragua, all three countries being oppressed by the U.S. unilateral coercive measures. People are driven out of those countries. It's causing a tremendous brain drain in those countries. It's very, very a terrible situation. From an electoral point of view, because it's heavily biased toward opposition people, there are less opposition people in Venezuela. Um, but you know that's sort of a very cold comfort. And then there has also been a fairly sizable amount of returning to Venezuela. Um, and this is true also in Nicaragua as well, where people come and go, which doesn't get reported. In Cuba, not so much the case. In Cubans, people are leaving on a fairly permanent basis. But in Nicaragua and Venezuela, you do have people who go abroad, find out that things aren't all that hunky-dory, and then they return. But that is one of the major fallouts of the coercive measures.
So the brain drain is rather significant.
Yeah. And that affects particularly the health sector, and also technically the oil industry where they need technicians.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Walter, followed by Michael. So Walter, please go ahead.
Hi, Michael. Hi,
I have
Walter.
2 questions. Thank you for your presentation, Roger. Since you were speculating, I wonder if you would speculate or tell us what you think about whether a victory for Maduro or a victory for the right in an honest election, and if the right would win the election, that you would accept that, or do you think that Maduro should, quote, steal the election if that's what he did, and that would be a better situation? You seem to rule out the possibility that that he could have lost the election, much as Daniel Ortega lost the election despite huge crowds in Nicaragua prior to the election when the votes were counted, and he accepted it. But the other question is, if you put up the sample ballot, you'll see that right next to the PSUV, there is a party, PPT, and the Tupameros, and just below it is the PCV, the Communist Party of Venezuela. None of the 3 parties were allowed to field a candidate of their choosing in this election. And I was wondering, as an election observer, how come that gets left out of the report on the election? Is that the same court that solidified Maduro's victory, the president of which is a PSUV member, as well as many other members of that bench of PSUV members? That court removed the leadership in 2019 of the Tupamaro and the PPT because they weren't going to nominate Maduro. And this year, that same court removed the leadership of the PCV and instituted leadership that would nominate Maduro. So Maduro appears on 3 parties' ballot lines where the party itself doesn't want him as their candidate. So why couldn't that be allowed under democratic procedures in Venezuela?
Okay, sure. Good questions, Walter. On terms of whether there was a steal, I don't know. I mean,
You're an observer.
Well, yeah, but like, well, here's an example of 2000 steal in the United States. Can I really say that Biden was legitimately elected? I don't really know. But what I would say, I think is really clear, is that the opposition that was backed by the United States was not, they didn't really make a good faith shot at the presidency. They could have taken a.
What's that got to do with?
Let me finish, and then I know you have some strong feelings, and we'll have a chance to express them, but let me just try to respond to your questions, and then we'll go from there. They didn't make a good faith effort. A winning candidate could have probably won under the conditions of the U.S. unilateral coercive measures. If what they said was, I will run on a platform of keeping the advances, the social advances of Chavismo, but because I'm friendly to the United States and I will align with the Zionists and support the genocide in Palestine, the United States will back me and they'll drop the sanctions. That might have won, but the platform they went on was not a popular platform. It was a platform that was anathema to a country which has spent a quarter of a century enjoying the social benefits of a progressive government. In addition, they didn't even try to find a consensus opposition candidate. They found this. I mean, this guy was literally, you know, a complete unknown person without any political following, without any political party, anything else. They claimed that they had won the election by a margin of 70%. Now, let's go back to the year 2002. Chavez was elected to the presidency in 1998. In 2002, April of that year, the United States backed a military coup in Venezuela. That military coup abolished all the constitutional democratic institutions, the Supreme Court, the National Assembly. They abrogated the Constitution itself,
Roger,
and the legislature.
This has nothing to do with what the right did. There's nothing to do with what I asked. I asked why couldn't the Communist Party or the Tupamaros or the PPT run their own candidate? I asked you whether you thought it's better that Maduro win by stealing than lose. That's what I asked. I don't care about the right wing. I'm not enamored with the right wing. They can do what they want. They have a right to do what they want. They're Venezuelans. You know, the U.S. shouldn't tell them or not to tell them. But I asked you, if it's a democratic system, why couldn't the Communist Party run its own candidate?
Well,
Why couldn't the Tupamaros run their own candidate? They weren't going to endorse Maduro. They weren't going to slate Maduro.
I will address
allow that.
The first, you had a two-part question. I'm trying to answer to the best of my ability the first part, which was it a steal? The second part has to do with the deplatforming of those three parties. I'll get to them, so please be patient. But I want to address the first part, which is, was there a steal? So let me.
I didn't ask you whether to steal.
Okay,
I asked you whether you thought it was better to steal it than to have Maduro lose. I didn't say there was a steal. I don't know, and you don't know what the results are. So don't assume that I think it's a steal. I just asked you.
No, you asked me.
Okay,
so
whether it was. Let's try. We have about 12 people have their hands up. So Roger, if you would just go ahead and wrap up and address his question, and then we're going to move on.
So I wanted to continue on what happened in 2002 because I think it's instructive to what happened today, in 2024. So there was this military coup backed by the United States. That coup only lasted 47 hours because the people in Venezuela, the popular classes, rose up spontaneously, surrounded the Miraflores Palace, the headquarters of the government, and forced the return of Hugo Chavez in less than 48 hours. If the opposition really had the support that they had, they could have taken the streets very easily and forced that, because in 2002, the people defied the military and won, and it could have been done again. So I don't think the evidence points to a steal. Now we talk about the three different parties that you claim are been deplatformed. And so let me give a little bit of a different perspective of that. I'm Walter, as you know, I'm quite familiar with your perspective, but there's a different perspective, and I'll focus really on the PSAV, which is the Communist Party of Venezuela. The PSAV is a long established, very important leftist party. It doesn't have a lot of strong electoral support, like many communist parties, but it commands maybe 2% of the electorate. It has a long history of militancy. It was at one time an underground party, and it's under a leadership that is very strongly working class. It, has strong ties to certain labor unions and stuff like that. The PSAV took the position in 2024 of anybody but Maduro. It should be understood that after 25 years of supporting the presidency of a Chavista, and instead they supported a neoliberal candidate in the election. It should be understood that there would be defections in the party. And so right now, there are two groups that claim the banner of the Communist Party of Venezuela. And I had opportunities while I was in Venezuela to meet and talk with both sides on this issue. It's an issue that is, I would view as mainly internal to Venezuela. It's not one that me as a solidarity activist wants to take sides on. It's one that doesn't look good for either side. I think both sides have made some bad moves that were hard to justify. But I think it's fair enough to say that today on the ground there is two factions that came out of the same organization. One is recognized by the government and the other is not.
Okay, next is Michael, followed by Bill Meyer. So, and please, everybody be patient. We have about more than 12 people have their hands up right now. So Michael, if you'd go ahead, please.
Yeah, why don't Russia and China have a policy of trading with countries more rigorously the more sanctions the U.S. puts on them? Why don't they, I mean, if the U.S. puts sanctions on Venezuela, why don't Russia and China then just decide to trade with Venezuela more rigorously?
In other words, why doesn't China and Venezuela, China and Russia sort of compensate more because Venezuela is being attacked? Is that where you're going with that?
Yes.
That gets into questions that not that easy to speak about. But I would say that there's differences in both the Chinese approach and the Russian approach. The Chinese have mainly made their initiative in Venezuela and in Latin America on commercial grounds. They have an initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative, which a number of Latin American countries have joined, including Venezuela. But the Chinese have been very reluctant to go beyond commercial relations. The Russians have, on the other hand, have actually been more active in terms of military assistance, military training, both in Cuba and in Venezuela. Both countries have been, both China and Russia have been essential to the survival of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. I think that there'd be no question that had they not come to the rescue of these countries, and the rescue has taken a lot of forms, for instance, bringing COVID vaccines, not just economic aid. those countries would have been much weaker than they are today. So the question is, why don't they do more? That's a question I don't really have a good answer for, but I would say that what they have done has been critical and vital to the success of the social countries in Venezuela, in Latin America, who are striving for socialism.
Okay, next up is Bill Meyer. If you would please unmute yourself, and then we'll have Janet. So Bill, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for this forum. Thank you to Roger. I'm surprised you didn't mention an important event coming up this Thursday that Roger Harris is going to be part of. It's a report back from Venezuela with the U.S. Peace Council delegation. So if you want to hear more about it from other folks who also traveled there, I think that would be very valuable.
On that, I think someone put the announcement in the chat, but you don't get the chat until you get onto when you log in, and so you may have missed that. But if someone could put that back into the chat, I would appreciate that.
So I want to take this discussion from a anti-imperialist point of view, which I assume most of you here are anti-imperialist. I think it should be obvious, and Roger's made this quite clear, that if we don't support Maduro and his government, it's a victory for the U.S. imperialism. And as Caitlin Johnstone, one of my favorite writers on the internet, states, the U.S. empire is probably the most criminal, most devastating, destructive force that ever existed. This has to be ended. Maduro may not be perfect. Certainly he's not doing something for certain parties, Communist Party taking out. We don't know all the details. Roger's trying to help us explain this, and I don't think we have to attack Roger for this. He's bringing us information, and whether we agree with it or not, I respect that he went there and did this. There's been a recent Supreme Court ruling that the elections were totally acceptable, and many countries now are endorsing the elections as being true and accurate. I want to thank you for your photographs and stuff. And I've seen many other videos about this. Depends if you want to overthrow the government. If you want to overthrow Maduro, then you probably won't believe anything that these people say. But I think it's Gabriel Rockhill, who was one of my other favorite speakers, who's going to be a guest on your program here, made it quite clear in one of his interviews about the power that the empire has around the world in the media, cultural wars. They control the media so intensively that we're not even aware of it in the West. We think we're getting the news straight, and we're not. And it's people like Roger who does not subscribe to the empire and does not write for the mainstream media, that offers us an opportunity to hear another point of view. We're deluged, we're bombarded with Western media that says they want to overthrow Maduro. Why? I mean, it's to the benefit of the capitalists. So some of the things said earlier was that, a brain drain, people are leaving in the millions. It reminds me back to the 60s when Cuba had their revolution and millions left Cuba. Of course they did, because they weren't able to capitalize on the economy like they had been at the time. Those are the people who left, the people who were making riches and stuff. It's the poor people who stay. Maduro and Chavez was supported in fundamentally by the poorer people in Venezuela. So I don't know why there's even questions about that. But anyways, I guess
it's about 2 minutes. If we could.
Yeah. So let me just say finally that the chat room that you have going here is like a parallel discussion here, and a lot of things are being said in there that are just as important as being worded out here. So I appreciate what your group is doing, and I don't have a question for Roger because he's answered many of them for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, comrade.
Okay, Janet, followed by Richard Wright. So Janet, please go ahead. Unmute yourself, please.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Roger, for sharing your observations with us. I did wonder whether the digital thumbprint technology came from Israel. Anyway, that aside. And you may have talked about this at the beginning, so forgive me if I missed it. Were members of the U.S. Peace Council delegation designated as official election observers? would you describe more about what else, who else was in the delegation and how it operated leading up to and during the election, like training and that kind of thing? And then separately, did you see any Russian presence in Venezuela? And does Venezuela currently do trade with Israel?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Janet. I'll try to do this quickly. I don't know where the technology came from on the biometrics, but we do know that from a very, very early position, the Venezuelans have been very strong in terms of supporting the resistance in Palestine. Just an anecdote is a friend of mine who's a Venezuelan was in Bolivia, and he met with the Palestinian ambassador to Bolivia, and he asked the Palestinian ambassador, "Who's the best Arab leader?" And the Palestinian ambassador said, Nicolas Maduro was the best Arab leader. So the connections are very strong with the Palestinian resistance. There were Russians there. They weren't particularly prominent. But just coincidentally, I was in Nicaragua for the celebration of their revolution, which takes place every year on July 19. And there, the Russians were very, very prominent in Nicaragua. But to get back to the role of the observers, there were about 110 internationals. We were technically called accompaniers. And look, can you see this? This is our credentials, and it just says international invitee. There were some people who received special training from the CNE, from the Electoral Authority, who had more access to the polling stations in terms of going in. So technically, I think we use the term observers, but I think the correct term was that we accompanied the election. And in terms of the U.S. Peace Council delegation, there was the four of us, Obama Assad, Jamal Baraka, and Vijay Prashad, and myself.
Hey, Richard, if you would, Richard Wright, if you would unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, Roger, I'll give you a couple of puff questions. Puffball. Give you a break from all the hard answers. One is, do you speak Spanish?
No, and real problem. Fortunately, there was a lot of translation, and if you realize with 910 people, invitees there, there were a lot of people that did not speak Spanish. Particularly the African delegations. There were Anglophile and Francophile delegations from Africa, and the Asians as well. So there was very, very ample translation. And then when we did the observation of the polling stations, we did have the people from the foreign ministry were called attaches. And for those of us who were not fluent in Spanish, they had English speaking attaches, and they encouraged us to just randomly, whoever you want to speak to, we'll translate for. And so, I would buttonhole people in the street and in the polling stations, kind of.
One of the questions, when you showed the touch screens, you showed the parties and their apparently who they endorsed. I'm kind of wondering what purpose does the party affiliation serve in the polling? Or, I mean, is there a secondary purpose other than election, the presidential election? And that's my question. Do you understand what I'm if when you showed the touch screens for the
Yeah.
polling, Maduro was associated with different parties, and I'm kind of wondering why they had the parties there. Do they add into the assembly, the General Assembly, or?
Yeah. Okay. So they have like a multi-party system where we have like functionally a two-party system. And in many multi-party systems, and in some states in the United States still, you have what is called fusion voting, where you could have more than one party endorsing the same candidate. The importance of so the party itself, each one of those individual parties chooses who they will endorse. And it's important also for the future of those parties because to maintain their ballot status, they have to get a certain amount of votes to be able to be in the next election, or they have to petition to get on to the to achieve ballot status, much like it is throughout the United States. And I'll just say as an aside, Machado, Maria Corina Machado, her party did not have ballot status. She never made an attempt to, even though she claimed that she had huge popular following, she could have easily petitioned for ballot status, but she failed to do so. Her party did not have ballot status because previous to that, they boycotted elections because they didn't believe that the government or the institutions of Venezuela were legitimate.
Okay, next is Karen, if you would unmute yourself, followed by Citizen One. So Karen, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm probably in a distinct minority in this discussion, but I really appreciate what you've been saying, Roger, and others. And I can definitely see how people are inspired by Venezuela, especially in the earlier days under Chavez. However, whether or not Maduro won the election, and I agree he probably did not, but it's hard to tell. It doesn't change the fact that we need to build a communist movement in Venezuela and all these countries. We cannot continue to choose just the lesser of two evils, whether it's here or elsewhere. And I don't think there's really any other solution to this. Venezuela relied very heavily, as you know, on its oil sales to sustain prosperity or to create some prosperity in Venezuela. When that tanked, the economy went to hell. And it's the working class that has suffered terribly. I don't think electing a social democrat or whomever is going to make a difference. The United States certainly has much of the blame for this, but it's also internal politics that contributed to the downfall of the economy. And I'm concerned about Venezuela turning more and more to China. I mean, they loaned China oil, or they gave China oil under Chavez as well. But today, China is one of its chief purchasers, and they're applying to join BRICS. And as you may know, BRICS is this alliance of countries around the world to counter the United States. And it includes these fascist countries like Iran. They invited Hungary's Orban to a meeting recently. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent. So I don't know if you have any comments about the role of Venezuela and China or any other issues.
Well, thank you, Karen, for your comments.
Sure.
They cover a broad area, so I'm going to just try to focus on three of the things I heard from you. One is the difference between Maduro and Chavez. The other is the downfall of the economy. And the third one, which I think is your really central point, is how do you build socialism in the 21st century? So starting off with Chavez and Maduro, there are a number of people, particularly on the left, or what I would call more far left or ultra left, who say, well, Chavez was great, but Maduro was not. And I think that is very similar to those people who say Marx was terrific, but Lenin really got it wrong. Rather than seeing that Marx and Lenin were part of a working class ideology continuity, they operated in different periods under different conditions, and that one complemented the other. And I think that's the case with Chavez and Maduro. We can go into that more if people had questions about that. But I think basically, if anything, Maduro has been a more consistent Chavista than even Chavez, but that he operates in a very, very different geopolitical context. So that was the first thing. The second thing is the economy, and I wanted to have the opportunity to mention that because I wanted to talk about how the unilateral coercive measures, those what they call sanctions, how they operate, because they operate in a very pernicious way. Sanctions are designed to punish, but that's not only thing that sanctions do. What they really do, what they're focused at, what the purpose of sanctions is to prevent recovery, to make the socialist experiment fail. And just an analogy would be, I'm sure all of us have had the experience of tripping and falling. You collect yourself and you get up. Well, the tripping and falling would be analogous to problems internal to Venezuela, corruption, mismanagement, things like that. Also, the international situation of the collapse of international oil prices, all those contributed to the falling of the economy. But what happened is that the bully, once Venezuela fell, put his boot on the neck of Venezuela and prevented the bully from getting up. And that's the purpose of sanctions, is that you can't get around them. So they cut Venezuela off from international finance and stuff like that. The really miracle, the economic miracle that Maduro implemented was that he has turned the economy around. They had triple and quadruple inflation. The economy was in free fall, and now the GDP projections for Venezuela are amongst the highest in the hemisphere, twice of the GDP projections for the growth in the U.S. So we see that even with the sanctions, which were designed to prevent Venezuela from correcting problems, they have gone around them and have made a very strong attempt and somewhat successes in moving forward. Finally, on the question of socialism, this is a very big question. It's probably the theme of the Sunday mornings at the library. I would just say that I would quote the analogy that Linera, he was the vice president of Bolivia under Evo Morales, and he described that it's a different situation, let's say in Cuba, where the bourgeoisie was expropriated and they don't exist anymore. In Venezuela, in Nicaragua right now, there's a situation where the bourgeoisie are still there. And it says, when you have to build socialism under those conditions, it's like overhauling the engine of your car when it's still running. It's very difficult, but comrades realize that we haven't had a socialist revolution for half a century. And that doesn't mean that we stop the struggle. And the struggle continues in countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua.
Okay, Citizen One, followed by Charlie, and hang in there, Gene, and others. So go ahead, Citizen One, please.
Yes, thank you. A British professor friend of mine, a sociology professor friend of mine in British, Afro-Caribbean, pointed out to me something that I didn't know until I guess she mentioned this a year or two ago, that Britain took part of the Marshall Plan money provided to Western Europe and set up the national health care system. And one thing Roger said about, the purpose of sanctions, I felt that leftists and maybe Marxists in particular in the United States hadn't really pointed out that that was the true purpose of sanctions against even Cuba, to prevent the demonstration of a successful socialist country just 90 miles off the coast of Florida that had, as they do today, free national health care, free education. Everyone is guaranteed housing, and all the other generous things that would come with a socialist economy. And that successful result, can you imagine that like in the 1960s happening? And then Americans are like, wait a minute, this little country is doing all this. We're the richest country in the world. Where is our free national health care, et cetera? So I just wanted to add that. The thing I really wanted to say before Roger said that is that I posted in the comments section, but for people who will view the video recording later, I posted in the comments section a brief commentary, like a 3-minute commentary, although the full video is 5 minutes and 24 seconds, by Juan Gonzalez of Democracy Now! And that video is called Two Faces of American Capitalism, Juan Gonzalez on what the DNC and RNC reveal about US politics. I'll repeat that title. Two Faces of American Capitalism, Juan Gonzalez on what the DNC and RNC reveal about US politics. And the thing that Juan Gonzalez said that I found breathtaking, but of course true, he spoke of the choreographed mass spectacle of the DNC worthy of Leni Riefenstahl, which we all know was the Nazi propaganda filmmaker. And he spoke of, I'm just going to say it briefly, he goes into it more.
Citizen One, just a quick note, as much as I actually sympathize with some of the things you're saying, I have to say, we want to try to keep this on the discussion of Venezuela.
Yes,
Can you tie it into that?
That's what I,
yeah.
Yes, that's what I intend to relate it to.
Okay.
So he spoke of the Republicans having a white supremacist neoliberal capitalism and the Democrats having a multiracial neoliberal capitalism. And where this relates to this discussion, and perhaps Roger might want to respond to it, he pointed out that the Democrat Party is even more aggressive in its imperial and regime change policy than the Republican Party. And all the, US attempts at regime change. And I was surprised when I saw, a room full of Democrat Party conventioneers shouting, USA, USA, USA. To me, the MAGA-ish, white right-wing, knuckle-dragging hooliganism kind of chant that, has been common in this country. So I'm wondering what Roger says, if you'd like to, about that fact that we've seen in the past, I don't know, like even 20 years under the Democrats, that they have an even more aggressive imperialist and regime change policy than the Republican Party. Thank you.
Roger, if you could try to tie that in back very tightly.
I'll just,
and of course, this relates to Venezuela.
Just very briefly and superficially, and I'll apologize for not really giving the question the due analysis that it requires. As you pointed out, the critical thing to realize is that both parties of capital have the same objectives, which is the projection and perpetuation of the U.S. empire, a settler colonialist empire at that. but they sometimes have different strategic means. Right now, it appears that the Democrats are well, maybe I'll put the Republicans are more interested in maybe taking on China first and then Russia. The Democrats are more interested in taking on everybody. But I think the overwhelming situation internationally is that the neocon political ideology is now embraced fully by both parties.
Okay, next is Charlie, followed by Jean, and then Sharon. So Charlie, please go ahead and unmute yourself. Charlie Hinton. If you could unmute yourself. There you go.
Roger. You mentioned the car. I want to get very specific about Venezuela again. You mentioned the Carter Center at one point saying Venezuela had the best electoral system in the world. Yet on these elections, their official report says Venezuela's 2024 presidential election did not meet international standards of electoral integrity and cannot be considered democratic, and it goes on. So I wondered if you would comment specifically on the Carter Center.
Yeah, good to see you, Charlie, and thanks for the question. That was probably a little opportunistic of me to use the Carter Center because, I don't have the reference here, but the National Lawyers Guild International Committee put out a very, very good refutation. If anybody has that media link, National Lawyers Guild International Committee Carter Center, you can browse for that. That would answer the question in much more detail. We have to realize that Carter became a liberal after he became president, not during his presidency. He was actually for small government and deregulation when he was president, and a cold warrior at that.
He was terrible with Haiti elections.
But the Carter Center clearly was a political hit piece. The head of the Carter Center is a former USAID employee, I believe, and the Carter Center is funded by in part by the United States government as well. So they put forward a position that was really a position that was a U.S. government position. Well, I think what was interesting was that while they try to cast aspersions on the actual vote, if you read their statement, it doesn't contest anything about the vote, but deals with peripheral issues. But it's designed to basically the same design that the U.S. imperialists have, which is to delegitimize Venezuela, and in doing so, not recognizing its sovereignty.
Okay, next is Jean, if you would unmute, please. Jean.
Okay, well, thanks, Roger. It's great to see you, and thanks for all the work you're doing here and clarifying this situation. It's really wonderful. But I just wanted to comment, back in the day, there was this big fuss over the Suez Canal and whether it should remain open and so forth. And a very great statesman, Sir Anthony Eden, said, gentlemen, we are talking about oil. And I'm just wondering, to what extent are we talking about oil here?
Yeah, so, thank you for bringing that up, because probably most of you know, but Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. It also has very significant natural gas reserves and also precious metals. Gold is one of the largest gold reserves in the country, and a number of other natural resources. So clearly the imperialists are interested in why all of the U.S. oil is under Venezuelan soil, particularly that the Venezuelans are frittering away the revenues from the oil on social programs rather than enriching the bourgeoisie. So that is a major part of the imperialist offensive against Venezuela and why it's such a high stakes thing. Realize that July 28th, the whole world was watching Venezuela. It was probably the most significant election in this year, or at least that sort of betrays my view that in the U.S. election, I already know who's going to win. The bourgeoisie will win in the United States. But in Venezuela, that was at stake. But there's more that was at stake. Venezuela is one of the leaders in the support of the Palestinians internationally, and it's important for the resistance thing. Venezuela has been a very important element in regional integration and unity. Absolutely important. I think probably that more than anything else threatens the United States, that if the countries of Latin America united, they would be better able to resist U.S. imperialism. So there are many reasons for the imperialist assault and the hybrid war against Venezuela.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Sharon, followed by Norma.
Thank you, Roger. I think there's a subtext in this discussion that has to do with the role of in the United States of anti-imperialists. And I think that we can learn a lot from history. So how does US foreign policy ever get changed, given that there's a historically a bipartisan support, bipartisan foreign policy, and the Democrats and the Republicans have certain differences, but they're basically the same. Whoever is elected, both people are running to be the president of US imperialism. They may have a lot of differences on domestic policies, but neoliberalism is in charge in foreign policy. So do we just give up and say we can't do anything about it? Of course not. Of course not. We need to learn from our history. And we should continue to be opposed to the embargoes. We should continue to teach Americans what's wrong with US foreign policy, what's wrong with having embargoes, what's wrong with providing 2,000-pound bombs to Israel. And if you don't think that we can make a difference, then just look at the history of the Vietnam War. Now, of course, it was 2 million Vietnamese who died and 50,000 Americans. That's a big difference. But I have spoken to representatives of the Vietnamese government, and they are acknowledged, their view of the history of what happened is that the US anti-war movement played a major role in helping them throw the Americans out. And if you don't believe me, then I recommend that you watch the PBS movie that came out last year, I think, called The Movement and the Madman. I highly recommend that. Thank you.
Roger, any comment?
Just one comment. Excuse me. The Venezuela is not simply under an embargo, and you probably just use that loosely. So it's not. I meant to correct you, but it is a teachable moment to talk about the nature of the hybrid war, which is a blockade. A blockade isn't really an act of war.
Yes, of course I meant it.
And the blockade is multinational. And so, there's like getting insulin. very important for diabetics in Venezuela. Fortunately, the Russians have helped Venezuela get insulin, but Venezuela was willing to go onto the cash market and buy insulin for their people. And because of the blockade, you can't just use the Venezuelan currency, the bolivar, to buy something from Switzerland. You have to go through a system called the Swiss system, which allows the U.S. dollar to be the unit of transaction. So the U.S. government has used the blockade against third parties to prevent things from getting to Venezuela, even when Venezuela had the money to pay for it. In addition, and you'll see that actually it's gotten into the mainstream press, there's overcompliance with U.S. sanctions because the U.S. will then levy fines against the country that that violates the sanctions against Venezuela. But it's not always clear what's the violation. So other countries will be cautious to avoid business with Venezuela, not even because there is a direct sanction, but because they fear that the United States would go after them if they make a mistake.
Okay, Norma, please unmute yourself.
Right. Hi, hello, everybody. The conversation has been so rich and deserving of respect on all points. The United States has, somebody asked why the United States is not in resistance, not developing a struggle in the left direction. The United States has this incredibly strong tool. It's somebody once was talking about what 2025 is about, the supposed Trump doctrine, talking about that Trump for the 3 years had built up allegiance for him in all kinds of structures that have not been thought about. Well, the schools do that. Basically, they teach that we are all free. We live in freedom and democracy. And people say this from the time they're in kindergarten or before. And it, along with their churches.
Norma, can you tie this into the topic for today, the Venezuela, real quickly?
I'm answering the question of why the U.S. doesn't rise in rebellion, similar.
Right. But today, just the topic today on Venezuela.
Similar.
Do you have a question about that or comment?
Why do you always interrupt, Alan?
Okay, I'm sorry.
You can't take this kind of thing.
No, the thing is,
all right,
let me finish.
Let me finish. I'll scream my line. My line is that school supports the anti-liberation struggles. Yes, the DNC was screaming, "Keep my slavery, keep me in slavery."
Okay. Citizen one, if you would go ahead.
If that relation to the topic is not evident, then I have given the attendees more credit than I should have,
Okay,
Alan.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
okay,
don't
so
do
Citizen
that.
one, would you go ahead?
Yes, I just wanted to follow up with another question for Roger, but first I wanted to point out that the goal of U.S. foreign policy under Democrats has even been regime change in Russia. So my question, follow-up question for Roger, is that, you know, I always thought that Bernie was a bait and switch candidate when he ran for president. But what I was amazed at was that Bernie calling Maduro a brutal tyrant. And I was also amazed at the silence of the squad writ large. I mean, they, if I'm correct, and certainly of Bernie, they all call themselves socialists, but the silence of the squad writ large on Venezuela and regime change there. There wasn't a peep out of any of them, except for Bernie calling Maduro a brutal tyrant. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that, Roger.
I think I think what you said was obvious, and I probably couldn't add anything to that.
Can you speak up, Roger? I didn't quite hear you.
Oh, I think what you said was correct and obvious, but I don't I can't think of anything to add to that.
No speculation why?
There is a consensus in the United States. It's a consensus that emanates from Washington, but it's reflected in the mass media, and that is that the United States has a responsibility to impose a rules-based order on the world. That rules-based order is, and that's in the national security doctrine under Biden. And what that means is the United States makes the rules and everybody follows them. And what you're pointing out is that the officials in Congress will agree with that position. And I certainly think that's worth pointing out, and I agree.
But Bernie? How do you explain that of Bernie?
I don't have that explicitly.
I'd like to jump in and just make a quick comment since we're pretty much ready to wrap up. Related to some of the things that others have brought up during the discussion. One of the things that strikes me about this issue is that the real question here is, how do we frame what's going on? And I was camping with some friends and was out of touch with what happened in the election. When I got back, I tried to do a Google search. The first thing that came up was the Voice of America, as often in Google searches, you end up getting the mainstream. And the first thing that they said was they started raising charges about the illegitimacy of the election the day after the election. And to me, the question comes down to, how do you, what is your talking point? The spearhead of Western imperialism in Venezuela has been to delegitimize the election. And the question is, why is it that so many people who are quote unquote on the left have joined that bandwagon and made that the key question that they want to address? And if you really look at the evidence, a lot of the evidence that has been brought up by the so-called left opposition really doesn't, there's really not a very strong case that there was a great deal of the vote came out 52 to 44. The more objective opinion polls confirmed the result, etc. So why harp on that, right? Why is it? Because basically what you're doing is you're aligning with the narrative and the framing of the question that is being put forward by the Voice of America and all the other Western outlets. The last thing I'm going to say, and this really pertains to the question of how, for those of us who are communists, to look at how we should view this, really the importance of the question of sovereignty in Venezuela, that if you really want to look at a good case of where sovereignty was sacrificed, take a look at Ukraine, where today the country has been plundered, where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in the war, where BlackRock controls the agricultural sector. And if you really look at it, and opposition parties are outlawed, for those of you who are making this issue of the fraud in the election, what would happen if Machado and the ultra-right took over? And now that doesn't mean that we say, well, we don't care about the election, but why cast so much attention and doubt on such flimsy basis when the stakes are so high here. And I think that that's where I would say that I have disagreements with some of the people on the left who have been making this the issue. Roger, please comment.
Yes, please. Thank you, Alan. Let me make some concluding remarks, and then we can all go our happy ways. And I want to thank everybody here. There's a problem of normalizing imperialism, saying, "Oh well, yeah, we recognize that there's imperialism, and we recognize that these unilateral coercive measures that are asphyxiating the Venezuelan people, but the Venezuelans should have done this and done that." And so we don't really look at that. And that is exactly what the press has been doing. It's kind of focusing on the parking tickets of the murder victim and not on the murderer itself. And so I think it's very important for us on the left to say, we don't want to normalize imperialism. It's wrong for the United States to be intervening in the internal affairs of a country. It is absurd that the United States would be running a candidate in a foreign country. We should be saying that these unilateral coercive measures are the overarching issue. And that is what we should be focusing on, because that is what is hurting the working class, and it's hurting the popular classes in Venezuela. And not to sort of say, well, yes, but that we have to keep that focus on not normalizing imperialism. And then the other thing, very simple, is that the Venezuelans have the right to defend their revolution. Every revolution has a responsibility and a right to defend its revolution. When they defend themselves, they're called authoritarians. Authoritarian, we should understand, is a euphemism for supporting the revolution. And I'll close there with a thank you very much for the really excellent comments and questions. And thank you, Alan, for moderating.
Okay, thank you very much. Want to remind everybody to come back next week. Go to our website, ICSSmarks.org. You can sign up for notifications. I want to thank Roger for his presentation, and I want to thank everybody for the questions. Great discussion, and we hope to see you all back soon.
Okay.
Thank you, Roger.
Thanks, everyone.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.